Hi, everybody. Welcome to the fourth session of the Western Vet podcast. Thank you so much for your attentive listening and feedback. It's brilliant to know you're still enjoying it. We're really lucky today to start off our new and our last summer term, really, with Mr. Balderson, our deputy head. And he is doing what would be considered probably a real literary classic. So I'll let him tell us a little bit about it to start before we get into our questions and answers.
Oh, thanks very much. I really agonised over which book to pick for this. But I've eventually picked Brideshead Revisited because it's just, I think, one of the best or most well-written novels, I think, in the English language. It's by Evelyn, Waugh, as I'm sure lots of people know. And it's just a really wonderful story and just incredibly well-written, even over and above that. So, I considered all sorts of people. I almost went for something by P.G. Wodehouse or something like that. Or even one of Waugh's other novels, because he is just a fantastic writer. But I think in the end it had to be Brideshead Revisited. So that's what I've chosen.
And I think as well that you're right. Every time people come on this, they always agonise over what to do and what book they really want to talk about and explore. And I think Brideshead Revisited is, everybody knows it. Even if you haven't read it, people know the kind of key imagery from the film, or they know a little bit about the storyline. And it is kind of considered his opus, I suppose, isn't it? What do you think it is about the book that makes it so fascinating, really, and so well endured?
I think it's just so incredibly powerful and evocative, and reading it, it's so detailed and well written, and the characters really spring to life. And even though it's of the sort of life that none of us probably will ever get to live, there's something sort of deeply emotional and powerful about it, and it's just a wonderful story to read. I think
it's really, I think as well, a really well framed story, because it's kind of sectioned off into three parts with a prologue and an epilogue, kind of bookending it. What do you think the benefits are of that kind of discourse style in terms of how it pulls readers through, and what it does to kind of feeling that you're getting a real closure to it as well at the end?
I think it's a really interesting model, isn't it? And it's one that we see a lot in films and TV programs nowadays. Where you start at the end and then you jump back, and the whole book in many ways is about reminiscing about a golden age, about the beauty of youth and innocence and all of that sort of thing, and about a sort of regret and nostalgia. I think for an age that is ending, is being brought to a close by the Second World War. And so, in a sense, starting with a prologue, how it's going to finish, which is quite interesting for the arc of the story. You know where it's going, and you know where it's going to end up. And there are moments in the story when perhaps it would be better not to know how it's going to end. There are sort of moments when everything seems like it's going to be okay, and there are moments of great hope, and then it all sort of comes to a close again in the epilogue.
I think that's sometimes the power, though, isn't it? Is that even if you know the ending, it's sort of like having that epic prologue at the start of Romeo and Juliet, knowing what's going to happen, is that it makes the hope almost more potent and more devastating, doesn't it? When you can feel it, but it's not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And really, the beautiful bit of the book, if you like, the bit that everybody really thinks of, that is only one summer at university. Charles goes to Oxford, he meets Sebastian Flyte, and is sort of drawn into this world that he would never have had access to. And, everything just seems amazing. And he becomes very, very close friends with Sebastian. And they go and stay at this beautiful house, Brideshead, for one summer, their first summer at university. And they're completely isolated there, just the two of them together. They've got the whole run of the house and grounds, and they discover wine tasting, and they build this really deep friendship. And that one summer really is the basis for that sort of feeling of nostalgia for the entire book. The rest of the book really is quite sad in lots of ways. It's full of regret and harking back to something that has been and is now gone. And so there's a deep sense of sort of longing and looking back at something that was beautiful and is now ended. And I think that's why it's so powerful.
On not living in memory, I think because of that, actually, it's so sad that most of his memories are centered around this one wonderful summer, and not, no matter how hard his life has become, not actually the other moments that occur in it. It's quite a good warning sign, isn't it? For when you hear people say phrases like, "Oh, this will be the best summer of your life," or "This is the best time of your life." It's like, don't hang on to that too much.
Yeah. Yes, and so years pass afterwards, and all sorts of things happen. It's, you know, it's, even though it's a relatively short book, it's packed full of different occurrences, different stories, different things happening within the main, you know, arc of the story. But actually, that one summer, that one beautiful moment of sort of leaving childhood behind and being a young, free adult is what it all really harks back to.
Yeah, and I think it's you're right as well. That central friendship is so key to the story. And what came up a lot for me when studying the novel at university was the actual ambiguous dynamics between Charles and Sebastian. There's been a lot of critics that look at whether or not their relationship is homosexual or just a representation of like a gentleman romance, as it were. Do you think that it's meant to seem ambiguous to it and meant to seem homoerotic, or do you just think that maybe part of the novel explores quite well a larger issue of the way we stereotype male friendships, for instance?
Yeah, so, no, I don't think this particular, the bond between Charles and Sebastian is a homosexual relationship. I think it's a very, very deep friendship, and I think they rely on each other, and they love each other clearly. It's a very strong bond that they form, and as time goes on, Charles talks about the fact that they isolate themselves from their friendship group. You know, at the beginning, Charles gets brought into this, you know, much wider circle of people that Sebastian's been at school at, and these sort of aesthetes of Oxford in the 1920s. And, you know, it's a wonderful, you know, his eyes are open to all sorts of people and experiences and things that he would never have seen. But as time goes on, they rely on each other an awful lot and isolate themselves from the world. But no, I think there are quite particular points where Waugh refers to homosexual relationships. I think Anthony Blanche, for example, he's quite clear that he's had a whole variety of different flings with all sorts of different people. And so the fact that he doesn't talk about that with Charles and Sebastian, I don't think is because of a sensitivity of the age or whatever it might be. I think it is that their bond is just different. So I always think of it as being a bit like Ratty and Mole in Wind of the Willows. Or something
maybe
like
Holmes and Watson or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I know that you went for another sort of summary Wind in the Willows. It's quite, I think you're right. The actual issue is that we sometimes, I think, we think that Waugh's being sensitive of that taboo of homosexuality potentially, but actually it's more that maybe we don't always give credit to male friendships in that way.
And I think it was quite a Victorian idea, which perhaps why Wind in the Willows sort of springs to mind, or indeed Holmes and Watson. Yeah, but yeah, I think perhaps it is just our own limiting thinking about what friendship looks like, and particularly sort of male friendships. But no, I think they rely on each other, and they need each other, and they fulfill something in each other. And so their friendship is very deep and personal. But I think it is a friendship as opposed to anything else.
I think there's a moment, isn't there, where actually she asks him, doesn't she? The sister, I've just very briefly forgotten her name. Julia. It's brilliant. Where she says, you know, you loved him, didn't you? And he says, well, yeah, he was sort of the first one. And it's, I think people use that quite often as an example, as like, well, he only loves her because he can't love Sebastian. But what he probably means more is that he was the first one that he did really love as a person, as a outside of a family and outside of himself.
Yeah, absolutely. And he does talk a lot about how Julia and Sebastian, you know, resemble each other very closely, and how Julia is almost a female version of Sebastian in some respects. But no, I think so as the story goes on later, clearly Sebastian, you know, descends into alcoholism and disappears. Really, he sort of goes off to a monastery in Europe and it almost just recedes from the story. And Charles ends up, after a long time, you know, falling in love with Julia, and there's very, very complicated stories about how they spend time with each other. And similarly, they seem to enjoy themselves the most when they isolate themselves from the world. They disappear off to America together for a couple of years, and it's an incredibly happy time for them. But ultimately it all comes back to, well, actually religion is a really central theme of the book, and it was for Waugh. I think a lot of people read the book and skip over that bit, because the thing that really sticks in the memory is the sort of beauty of Brideshead and of the the sort of fabulous lifestyle of an aesthete in the 1920s, and travelling to Venice or wherever, or Oxford, or wherever it might be. But yeah, in the end, it draws back to their Catholicism, the Catholicism of the Marchmain family, and how that is just a huge roadblock for Charles and Julia in particular.
And a lot of their happiness as well, actually, the way that they kind of, the idea of, I think the book, there's both a satire of faith and a celebration of it, is really interesting, because in moments their faith gives them great strength and great kindness and great power, but in lots of times it's also part of their destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the assumptions that they make as a family, and the way that they must act as a family, is dictated by their faith in a way that, to Charles as an onlooker, he just can't really understand. And then in the end, well, the great sort of arc of the story, I suppose, is that Charles, right at the very last paragraph of the book, gets drawn in and clearly has converted to Catholicism. And so I think rereading the book much later, that seems to really jump out of the pages. Whereas I think the first time I read it as a student, it was really the human aspect, the beauty and the characters and the story were just wonderful. And then rereading it many, many years later, different bits of the story really leap out, I think.
It's interesting as well, isn't it? Because like you said earlier, it kind of follows this humongous period of time in history and key parts of history in 1920s, the war. But like you said, when you read it again, it's actually the faith and the issues of faith and the celebration of faith is underlying and quite subtle. And then it kind of rears its head at key moments that you kind of skip over. But when you think about it really hard, the book is primarily, I think, about faith and about love, really.
Yeah, I think Waugh describes it as, I think the subtitle to the whole book is the sacred and profane memories of Captain Charles Ryder. And it's very easy first time round to put a bit less emphasis on that aspect compared to what I think for Waugh that's precisely what it was about. But no, I think the huge themes that it deals with are, war and love, and the end of the aristocracy brought about by, well, both the First and the Second World War. And a real sense of regret at what is replacing it. There are characters in there. Hooper crops up in the prologue as a very uninteresting, uncultured, unsophisticated sort of person. And Charles's reflections about where the world is going is that we're now moving into a world of Hoopers, and really, really contrasting with the appreciation of art and beauty and architecture of the aristocracy.
Kind of the end of romanticism, really, doesn't he? That in his world, the world becomes so industrial that we lose something.
Yeah, and I think Rex Mottram, who is Julia's first husband, it really symbolises how money has become quite crass, and the love of money and the pursuit of more money and wealth, as opposed to it simply being something that a great family has and uses to commission art and architecture and that sort of thing. He is interested in, he talks a lot about, the return on his investments, and he buys, I think the real symbol of that, I think, is he buys Julia for her birthday, a live tortoise with her initials embedded in its shell in diamonds. And Charles sort of looks at this thing in horror as, the most vulgar expression of wealth, as opposed to an appreciation of beauty.
It's really interesting, though, I think, isn't there? Because there is still, I think, almost the problem of classism anyway, because whether money, new or old, is used for art or for greed or power, it's almost, I think, it doesn't touch upon the issues that actually, no matter who has the money, there was such a divide in class, and the over celebration of that kind of old money aesthetic is quite problematic as well, I think, when you read it back as you get older.
Absolutely. Although I think there is a sense right at the end that Brideshead and what it represents, you know, the world that it represents has served its purpose and has done something. You know, the next phase is not all negative. You know, I think in saying, you know, the world of the future is a world of hoopers, and you know, there is some sense in which that's a good thing. I think, you know, he looks back with great nostalgia and a sort of romanticized idea of what the aristocratic age was like. But I think there is still a bit of a sense that despite its vulgarity and difference to that world, you know, at the very least, we've preserved something.
And changed something as well, I suppose. And actually, you know, post World War II, the divide between the classes did shrink a little bit. And actually, you know, that he doesn't touch so much on that in the war, but the fact that the house is used in the war efforts is really key in kind of moving it through time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really...
So sorry, go on.
no, go for it.
I was just going to say about the house, actually, because it is so central to the story, not just in his memory and the romanticism and what it represents, but it's quite often seen as a character, isn't it? I think almost as if it serves its own kind of plot line and purpose. Why do you think, because it's quite a common theme for houses to be key, I think Miss Havisham's house is also really relevant. Why do you think houses, so often as well houses of old money, do you have that effect on stories and why we centre stories around them? I'm just thinking about Westonbirt as well now.
Yes, yeah. Oh, and I was going to say, actually, I think it's so easy to think of Westonbirt as, you know, you could easily put it in the place of Brideshead, couldn't you? I mean, the house that everybody always thinks of is Castle Howard, because that's what they used in the 1980s TV adaptation, which is wonderful. But yeah, I mean, you can look out across the house and grounds here and think of some of the things that Charles talks about in the novel. You know, he really, in the epilogue, when he comes back to Brideshead, he looks out over these sort of landscaped gardens, which were designed with hundreds of years of the family in mind. They weren't built for now, they were built for 100 years in the future. And he sort of thinks about the fact that actually Julia could be, you know, appreciating the house and the grounds at their very pinnacle. They were designed 100 years ago and came to maturity right at that point, just at the point of their destruction, almost at the point that the whole, you know, structure of society that she represents is just being swept away. And so it's really interesting. I think at the point that Evelyn Waugh wrote it, you know, an awful lot of the great country houses were being literally pulled down because families couldn't afford to keep them. Which very nearly happened to Westonbirt, of course, you know, until it was turned into a school. And so I think he was writing it with a real sense of worry that essentially this really was it. Not just that the societal structure would be swept away, but also these sort of great, beautiful houses. And I think there's a beautiful
lands, I think, as well. The idea of how by over-industrialising, we destroyed so much of our countryside.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lovely bit where he goes and visits Brideshead for the very first time, and he says that, you know, his views architecturally had always been quite medieval, and then suddenly this was a conversion to the Baroque. And again, I think, you know, you only have to stand in the Great Hall at Westonbirt and look at, you know, that unbelievable fireplace to see what, you know, that is the Baroque, right in your face, as it were. And
there's,
you know, for anyone,
excellent line in Beauty and the Beast, which is quite embarrassing for me to remember, where he says something, I think, hilarious, like, if it's not Baroque, then don't break it. I just always remember thinking, that's brilliant, actually. That works so well when you see that kind of architecture and that art, and you're like, yeah, he's right. Don't let's not do anything with this. This is gorgeous.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the house itself has its own story, really. So Lord Marchmain, on his deathbed, he has this huge sort of Homeric soliloquy before he dies, where he talks about, actually, as well, where he talks about the family and the history and how Julia will inherit it. And he talks about the fact that the house used to be a castle a little bit further down the valley, and that it was taken brick by brick and rebuilt and converted into this, you know, beautiful house. And so that you really get that sense of permanence, of you know, being custodians of something across 1,000 years or more, rather than
simply... metaphor as well for a country, isn't it? And a person, that idea that actually sometimes you have to deconstruct something to make it into what could be better.
Yeah, and they've moved from, absolutely, they've moved from being knights and sort of military family to appreciating beauty and commissioning art and, having the most beautiful house and grounds. And then there's this new transition taking place where it's going to be swept away by something else, something different. Yes, and I think that real sense of permanence, I think, is really important.
And what's valuable in permanence as well? Like, actually, what is it that we need to keep sustaining in our country, in our lives, in our kind of relationships as well?
Yeah, rather than being swept away by the new money vulgarity of Rex Mottram.
I think it's such a. I think people often write off Brideshead quite often because they do think of it as this kind of slightly campy, over sort of tragic read about 1920s and with almost, I think people forget that it's also a war novel and it is a religious doctrine almost in many ways as well. And actually I think it's a really beautiful, really complex read that you can very easily, like you said, read it once and just kind of pick up on some of the beauty of it. But actually the more you, like we are now, I suppose, the more you just discuss it, the more you consider it, it's a really complex message about what humanity is and how time changes, not just individuals, but also countries and collectives of people.
Oh, absolutely. It's so complex, and there's so much detail and so much weight within each sentence. I think it's so well written that it, despite not being, it's not a huge epic novel. It's relatively short, but within that short space of time covers just so much. It's really wonderful.
Do you, I think my final question then, I suppose, which is probably quite a hard one, and I apologise, very philosophical, so it will suit you. Do you take any particular message or moral from the book as you read it and time goes on and you reread it? Is there anything that you often think this is what this novel means for me, and this is maybe what Waugh was trying to tell us?
It's really tricky, isn't it? I don't think there is a moral message as such. Well, obviously for him there was. For him it was Catholicism, and he clearly saw Catholicism as an unchanging constant in amongst the turbulent world that was coming. But really, I think if you look at the characters and you look at the things that happen to them and the things that they do, there isn't, for me at least, a moral message that stands out. But I think it is just sort of imbued with this sense of nostalgia and of what might have been good about the past. And sort of looking back on youth and beauty and loss and all of those things. I think it's more emotional, actually. I think it just sort of evokes all sorts of different emotions and thoughts rather than necessarily conveying a message, for me at least.
Because I think you're right. The issue of faith and whether people have it or not is often, if you're not a faithful person or you're an atheist or an agnostic, as Charles is throughout most of the novel, the message might be a little bit unclear, or that it's just to kind of trust the divine. But ultimately, you're right, it is so emotional, and it's a book about Charles's feelings, really, isn't it? And how they change and how he feels through time. I often never work out whether or not to think of it as almost quite bleak, because actually he does have this one wonderful summer and everything else seems to go roughly downhill from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or whether or not it's just a sort of celebration of all the highs and lows of life.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? It seems, as you say, it really is. It's so sad the whole way through. After that one sort of amazing summer, it's just full of sadness and regret, and things go wrong, and he loses that sort of beautiful friendship, and all sorts of things. But right at the end, I mean, to come back to the Catholic message, I mean, the whole of the third section of the book is called A Twitch Upon the Thread, and there's this sort of metaphor about fishing, and allowing a fish to sort of play on a line, and then finally pulling them in with a twitch on the thread. And right at the very last paragraph, he goes back to the chapel at Brideshead, and the lamp is still burning there, this sort of Art Nouveau lamp that he described. And for him, for Waugh, I think that is the sort of summation of what it's all about, that actually, even with all of the change, there is still this sort of constant. And it turns out that Charles has converted to Catholicism, and obviously Evelyn Waugh converted to Catholicism in about his 30s. And so it's quite deeply personal, I think.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually it is the only time in the novel that Charles does really pray at the very end, as if it's its culmination, that, like you said, almost has he been the fish this whole time, plucking with these strings of faith, to suddenly come to realise that he doesn't need to feel he has control over his life. He can relinquish it to God.
Yeah, I think actually it seems to me at least that everyone is on that particular string is the message from Waugh, that, you know, Julia almost goes and does her own thing, you know, defies what she ought to do, and nearly marries Charles. And, you know, Charles, having been this sort of middle class intellectual, suddenly gets into this incredible world and is amazed by all of it. And then, you know, obviously the eldest son, Brideshead, is disinherited, and Lord Marchmain wants to give the house to Charles and Julia, and it looks like he's going to marry Julia, he's going to inherit Brideshead. This whole unimaginable world is going to belong to him, and then in a single moment, really, it all falls away. Julia realizes she can't marry him, and so she is pulled back by her own faith. And so there are wonderful moments in there.
Wonderful, but generally quite devastating.
Sad.
I'm waiting for someone to come on and actually do a book with a happy ending. I just don't think I'm going to get it. Maybe Wind in the Willows is going to have to be the next one.
Maybe.
Well, thank you so much. It was brilliant to have you on and talk about
thanks for having me.
Another very brilliant and bleak book, really. And next week we will have on I think it's Miss Rogerson who is coming on next week, and actually we're going to do our first non-fiction text. So not so much chatter about happy or not happy endings, and more about kind of wider topics in the world. So thank you very much again, Mr. Balderson, and I'm looking forward to you all listening in next week again.